Welcome to another deep dive. We have just a massive, incredibly complex topic to explore today, and we are really glad you are here with us.
Yeah, this one is huge.
It really is. Before we get into anything else, though, please take a second to hit that like button, subscribe to the show. It really helps us out, and you will not want to miss the deep dives we have coming up.
Definitely do that.
So today, we are taking on something that is generating a massive amount of cultural friction online right now. We are reviewing a highly provocative, incredibly dense, and I mean deeply culturally significant ebook titled Holy Hydration, Divine Strategies for Rational Male Transformation by Conrad Riker. It was published in 2025.
Right, and it has been making waves everywhere.
Waves is the perfect word for it, actually.
Yeah.
Look, if you are trying to find the ultimate Rosetta Stone for understanding the modern manosphere, the men's rights movements, and really this entire cultural pushback we are seeing online, this book is it.
It really lays out the architecture of that whole worldview.
Exactly. To truly grasp the history of our institutions before their current cultural shifts, before they were captured by what the author describes as feminist and Marxist ideologies, you really need to read this firsthand. Go check Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play Books right now to buy the book, and make sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
It is a genuinely fascinating piece of cultural architecture. When you look at the shifting tectonic plates of modern gender dynamics, texts like this act as the seismic readouts. But before we look at a single page, we need to state our mission here with absolute clarity.
Right, the disclaimer.
Yes, we are here to extract the core philosophical, historical, and biological arguments from this massive text. The source material contains highly politically charged content regarding feminism, Marxism, and gender roles. We must explicitly clarify to you, the listener, that we are taking no sides.
Not at all.
Right. We are not endorsing these viewpoints, nor are we condemning them. Our role today is strictly to act as impartial guides, to impartially report and break down the fascinating, intense ideas contained in the original text. We're holding a mirror up to a specific cultural worldview so that you can understand its underlying mechanics.
Exactly. We're looking at the engine of this ideology, taking it apart piece by piece to see how it runs without taking the car for a joyride.
That's a good way to put it.
So to start, let's look at the core metaphor because the entire book hinges on it. Conrad Riker's central thesis is that men today are, in his words, drowning in lies.
Drowning in lies.
He argues that modern culture has labeled male strength as toxicity and male leadership as oppression. And his proposed antidote to this isn't talk therapy, and it isn't emotional vulnerability, it's water.
Yes, water.
But he's talking about adopting both the physical and the metaphorical power of water to reclaim what he calls divine and natural hierarchy. He draws on the biblical concept of living water, Daoist flow, Buddhist clarity, and Nietzsche's storm. How does he justify combining all these different philosophies into one central metaphor?
He does it by stripping away the modern, gentle interpretations of these concepts and returning them to their most primal, destructive, and creative roots. I mean, usually when we feel like water in modern self-help or corporate mindfulness seminars, it's framed as a call to be gentle.
Right, like accommodating and passive.
Exactly, to just go with the flow. Riker completely inverts that. He reminds the reader that water is the single most destructive force on the planet. It is the one force that outlasts mountains, completely reshapes landscapes, and obeys nothing but natural law. Softness, given enough pressure and time, shatters stone.
He's framing this as an uncompromising survival strategy then.
Very much so. To understand this text is to understand a demographic of men who feel entirely alienated by the modern emphasis on emotional vulnerability. They are desperately seeking a framework that validates their innate drive for structure, hierarchy, and conquest. And Riker is offering them water as the ultimate weapon.
That sets the stage perfectly for his first major argument, which focuses on the crisis of modern manhood. He sets the premise that modernity literally teaches men to apologize for existing.
Yes, that's his baseline assumption.
And he starts with a really stark comparison between two different approaches to trauma and recovery. What exactly is he looking at there?
He focuses on a specific demographic that often struggles with modern institutional frameworks, which is combat veterans. He describes a Marine sergeant returning from Fallujah with a chest full of medals and, as Riker puts it, a head full of ghosts.
Wow.
Yeah. He then looks at the Veterans Affairs solution around 2003, which heavily leaned on group therapy sessions. Riker paints this picture of battle-hardened warriors being asked to sit in circles, share their feelings, and essentially deconstruct their trauma through a purely emotional lens.
He mentions they were even sometimes utilizing art therapy or coloring books, right?
Right, exactly. And he contrasts the VA's 37% retention rate for that specific kind of talk therapy with a totally different approach taken by that same Marine years later.
What was the alternative approach?
That Marine eventually abandoned the clinical therapy model entirely and started a wilderness rehab program. But instead of talk therapy, the program used hard labor, physical exhaustion, and strict leadership drills.
It was very physical.
Extremely. The men built structures, carried heavy loads, and operated within a rigid, unforgiving hierarchy. And the sobriety rate for the men in that program after 2 years was 82%.
82% versus 37%. That's a massive gap.
It is, and Riker uses this massive statistical disparity to argue that compassion without structure isn't compassion at all. He calls it cultural sabotage.
How does he connect that to the broader audience who might not be combat veterans?
Well, he uses it to validate a deep suspicion held by many in his audience that institutional solutions are fundamentally misaligned with male psychology across the board. He argues that men are simply not built to sit in a circle and eternally deconstruct their emotions.
They're built to do things.
Exactly. In his view, they are built to act, to build, to carry a load, and to lead. When society denies that biological and psychological imperative, dysfunction is the inevitable result. And that leads directly into his concept of hydraulic gaslighting, which is arguably one of the most compelling sociological frames he constructs in the book.
I want to spend some time on that term, hydraulic gaslighting, because he uses some very visceral modern cultural moments to define it. He essentially defines it as systemic pumping of shame into the male psyche until their resolve just crumbles. And he points to the 2014 hashtag #YesAllWomen movement as a prime example of this. How does he frame that specific cultural moment?
So the Yes All Women movement sparked largely in the wake of the Elliot Rodger killings, right? It was designed as a way for women to share their universal experiences of harassment and fear. But Riker interprets the mechanics of that movement entirely differently.
How so?
He argues that the hashtag was weaponized to indict all men for the extreme violence of a few. He points out the double bind it created. If a man defended himself by saying hashtag note all men, he was instantly accused of deflecting blame, minimizing female trauma, and centering himself.
But if he stays silent?
If he stayed silent, he was branded as complicit in a violent patriarchal system. Riker calls this a syntax hack.
A syntax hack?
Yeah. It's a conversational trap designed specifically to exploit male guilt, force an apology for simply existing as a man, and destabilize natural male authority.
He also brings up a few other corporate and institutional examples of this, like the infamous 2019 Gillette ad. I remember that causing a huge uproar.
Oh, absolutely. The Gillette toxic masculinity ad is a cornerstone of this argument. The ad famously depicted men engaging in bullying, harassment, and mansplaining, urging men to be better. Riker points out that the video received over 1.5 million dislikes on YouTube.
1.5 million dislikes.
Yeah. And he doesn't view that backlash as men defending bad behavior. Instead, he cites it as proof that men were rejecting the underlying premise of the ad. The lie that traditional male strength and assertiveness are inherently flawed or toxic. He argues that the corporation was attempting to perform hydraulic gaslighting on its own consumer base.
And there's another story he uses that moves away from internet culture and into real-world consequences involving an Oklahoma fire captain. What happened there?
So in 2019, an Oklahoma fire captain was reportedly demoted for aggressive leadership during a warehouse fire. The critical detail Riker emphasizes is that the captain's aggressive commands, his raised voice, and his absolute unyielding demand for compliance in that high-stress environment literally saved his team's lives.
Because they were in a burning building.
They were in a collapsing structure, yes, and his rigid hierarchy got them out alive. Yet the institutional HR apparatus penalized him for his tone.
For his tone. Unbelievable.
Riker uses this to ask a much broader question. What happens to a society when the very traits required to maintain civilization and survive physical reality aggression, decisive leadership, physical courage, are pathologized in peacetime? He argues that modern witch hunts don't burn men at the stake, they torch their reputations and their livelihoods for exhibiting the exact traits that keep society from collapsing.
That's a heavy critique of modern institutions, but he doesn't just leave it at sociology. He takes this argument into some incredibly dense philosophical territory. He grounds this worldview using an acronym, the CTMU. Can we break down what that actually is and how he uses it to justify his perspective?
Sure. The CTMU stands for the Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe. It's a highly complex fringe theory of reality developed by a man named Christopher Langan, who is known for having one of the highest recorded IQs in America. To explain it simply, the CTMU essentially argues that the universe isn't just a collection of dead matter. It operates more like a giant, self-configuring language or a piece of cosmic computer code. Reality is a syntax.
Reality is a syntax, and Riker applies gender to this.
He does. He lifts this concept and posits that in this cosmic code, men have a specific, immutable grammatical function. They are the active verbs. They are the causal agents, the architects of order, the ones designed to act upon the universe.
So how does he connect this cosmic theory back to his critique of modern feminism in HR departments? That seems like a big leap.
He argues that when a culture demands that men become passive, endlessly accommodating, or deferential to emotion over logic, it isn't merely a cultural shift or a social trend. In Riker's framework, it is an active violation of universal law.
Wow.
Yeah, when you deny men this cosmic agency, this God-given role as the stewards of order, he claims you cause a literal syntax error in reality itself. He tells his readers that they can feel this glitch in their bones.
Like a structural wrongness.
Exactly. It's that exhausting paradox where taking charge gets you canceled for being domineering, but being passive makes you entirely disposable and invisible to women. He argues that you cannot dam a river and expect it not to seek a destructive outlet if you don't provide a constructive one. If you block a man's teleological purpose, he will either implode into a passive state of depression or explode into unguided anger.
That is a massive philosophical leap, going from basic sociology to universal cosmic law. Does he offer any practical tools for his readers to navigate this syntax error, or is it purely theoretical at this point?
No, he is intensely practical. He introduces a concept called the Dominion Journal. He explicitly tells men to throw away any journal where they write down their feelings or practice gratitude in a passive sense.
No gratitude journals.
Right. Instead, the Dominion Journal is a ledger. You are instructed to track your daily decisions like a ruthless CEO tracking profit margins. He wants you to document every single interaction where you perceive a modern narrative undermining your authority.
What kind of interactions is he telling them to log? Give me an example.
Micro interactions. Did a barista sneer when you confidently stated your order? Log it. Are you hesitating on asking for a promotion because you don't want to seem aggressive to a female manager? Write it down, and the rule is you must fix it by Friday.
You have to take action on it.
You must take the action. He uses the phrase, stagnant ponds stink, but rivers carve canyons. The goal of the journal is to force men to stop asking, how do I feel about this, and start demanding, what will I build today, and who is standing in my way?
He actually attempts to back up the necessity for this masculine decisiveness with data, which is interesting. He contrasts the study from OkCupid with a Gallup poll. What is the disparity he is highlighting there?
This juxtaposition of data is the absolute crux of the crisis he is trying to identify. On one hand, he cites a 2020 OkCupid study analyzing user behavior and preferences, which concluded that 72% of college-educated women still actively seek out traditionally masculine partners.
Meaning men who are decisive, protective providers?
Exactly. Biology and female preference, according to this data point, still heavily select for those ancient traits. But then he contrasts that with Gallup polling data showing that 58% of men under the age of 35 fear false accusations, HR complaints, or social cancellation if they assert dominance or display traditional masculine assertiveness in public or professional spheres.
So he's pointing to a massive contradiction between what people are attracted to privately and what institutions demand publicly.
Precisely. He is highlighting a cultural double bind. The biological software is demanding one thing, but the institutional software is actively penalizing it. The Dominion Journal is his proposed tool for men to debug that institutional software and realign themselves with what he sees as their natural causal agency.
That idea of modern institutions failing men leads right into some of his most controversial material, where he actually targets modern theology and tradition. He shifts into examining what he calls biblical hydration and Daoist flow, and he starts by outlining the four wells of masculinity. What are these wells, and why does he argue they are under attack?
The Four Wells framework is where Riker strongly appeals to the traditionalist, religious, and conservative segments of his readership. The Four Wells are provider, protector, priest, and pioneer.
Provider, protector, priest, pioneer.
Right. He argues that these are the primal, divinely ordained roles of men. A man who neglects any of these wells, according to Riker, becomes a spiritual nomad. He claims that a man cannot be whole if he is just a provider but not a protector, or a pioneer who lacks the spiritual grounding of a priest for his family.
He has sociological research for this too, doesn't he?
He does. He cites research suggesting that 67% of men who lack a connection to all four of these pillars experience severe midlife crises or breakdowns.
And his primary target for why these walls are drying up is actually the modern church, right? Which is surprising.
Yes, his sharpest critique in this section is leveled directly at modern religious institutions. He asserts that feminist critics have successfully infiltrated the church and now scream toxic masculinity at all four pillars. Well, they reframe the provider as an oppressive breadwinner hoarding financial control. The protector is reframed as a violent patriarch. The priest is seen as an outdated barrier to egalitarian spiritual leadership.
And he goes back to Genesis to counter this.
He points to the book of Genesis, noting that God commissioned Adam to work and keep the garden, which Riker emphasizes are active verbs demanding stewardship and dominion, not just showing up to collect a paycheck. He claims modern men have mistaken true provision for mere paycheck slavery because the church has stopped teaching them how to rule their domain.
He backs up this critique of the church with some specific institutional data too. What does he point to?
He cites a 2023 report from a prominent Southern Baptist seminary, which found that 54% of graduates began denying biblical inerrancy, the belief that the Bible is without error, after taking required courses in feminist and liberation theology.
54%.
Yeah, he views this as an ideological virus. He also highlights anecdotal extremes that have made headlines, like pastors replacing traditional baptismal fonts with sand ceremonies to avoid the imagery of water, which some allegedly claimed was triggering.
Or that minister in Colorado.
Right, a Colorado minister who was fired by their congregation for refusing to perform a baptism using gender-neutral pronouns for God.
How does he react to those changes within the church? I imagine not well.
With absolute hostility. Riker argues that any church that guts its sacred ancient language to appease modern feminist sensibilities is actively vandalizing the only spring that can quench a man's soul.
And he uses the story of Moses here.
Yes. The biblical story of Moses striking the rock at Meribah as his ultimate counterexample. When the Israelites were dying of thirst in the desert, Moses didn't sit around in a circle, share his anxieties, and politely request hydration from the universe. He took his staff and physically struck the rock to draw out living water through an act of disciplined, decisive, even violent action. Riker uses that imagery to tell men that you do not negotiate for your survival or your spiritual authority, you enact it.
It's a very rigid, hard-edged interpretation of biblical dominion. But what is really fascinating about his rhetoric is how he pairs that rigid biblical framework with Daoism, which is entirely about adaptability and non-resistance. How does he blend those two seemingly contradictory philosophies?
You would think that Daoism's emphasis on flowing like water and yielding to force would contradict the hard-edged patriarch model he just laid out, but Riker synthesizes them brilliantly for his audience. He brings in Bruce Lee's famous "Be water, my friend" philosophy from 1971.
A classic quote.
But crucially, he contextualizes it. He doesn't frame "Be water" as a call to peace, he frames it as a martial strategy. He points out that Bruce Lee developed this philosophy after a real, brutal, no-rules fight in Oakland in 1968 against a traditional martial artist named Wang Jackman.
Right, because Lee realized during that fight that his traditional Wing Chun stances were too rigid.
Exactly. He was fighting the man, but he was also fighting his own inflexible tradition. So he adapted. He became formless.
And Riker uses that as a blueprint for navigating the modern workplace.
Yes, he applies this martial arts history directly to cultural warfare. He brings up a 2,300-year-old Daoist parable about Ting the Butcher. According to the parable, Ting's meat cleaver never dulled after years of use. Why? Because instead of hacking mindlessly against the hard bone, Ting trained his eye to see the microscopic gaps in the joints, and he simply sliced through the empty space.
So the path of least resistance.
Right. Riker tells his readers that this is the exact strategy men need to survive modern HR departments, diversity mandates, and campus politics.
So he's telling them not to fight the system directly.
He is telling them not to smash themselves against the rigid concrete of modern institutional feminism because they will just get fired or canceled. Instead, he advocates for what he calls Daoist butchery.
Daoist butchery? That's quite a term.
Maintain your internal, rigid structure, your biblical dominion, but remain completely fluid in your tactics. Find the fractures in their logic, navigate the gaps in their policies, and flow through them to achieve your own objectives. He points to Pew Research indicating that 68% of men now actively suppress their natural personalities and adaptability just to meet corporate demands for compliant behavior. Riker argues this rigidity breaks under pressure.
He gives a really interesting corporate equivalent of this Daoist flow versus rigid structure, comparing Twitter to Amazon.
He looks at the early days of social media and e-commerce to illustrate this. He brings up Twitter's notorious fail whale era around 2012, where the platform constantly crashed under high traffic. Riker argues this was a symptom of a rigid, top-heavy corporate structure that couldn't adapt to surging currents of data.
And he contrasts that with Jeff Bezos' famous 2 pizza teams rule at Amazon, right?
Yes, the idea that no team should be larger than what 2 pizzas can feed. Riker claims Bezos' secret sauce was essentially corporate Taoism. These small teams weren't burdened by rigid central command. They were self-governing, highly adaptable river tributaries flowing organically toward a shared goal. He summarizes this entire philosophy with the line, "Water doesn't argue with rocks. It carves Grand Canyons while sipping espresso."
That brings us to a major pivot in the book. He moves from mental and strategic flow into absolute physical reality. He insists that to maintain that level of Taoist adaptability and biblical resolve, a man cannot be physically or biologically compromised. This is where he introduces the idea of modern culture acting as an endocrine disruptor. He views the environment itself as a biological weapon.
This section is the intellectualization of the internet's common soy boy critique. Riker shifts from philosophy to endocrinology. He posits that modern culture doesn't just have bad ideas, it literally functions as a biological toxin.
He makes some historical comparisons here too.
He doesn't hold back. He compares the modern digital landscape, social media, algorithmically driven news feeds, infinite scrolling to the ancient Romans inadvertently channeling actual lead through their bathhouse pipes and poisoning their elite class.
Wow.
Only today, he argues, we are voluntarily pumping digital lead directly into our neural pathways.
Does he have data to support the idea that the digital environment is biologically degrading men?
He cites several studies, including a prominent 2022 Stanford study on digital fasting. The study showed that men who completely eliminated digital distractions, deleting social media, stopping the endless scroll of outrage content, reported 63% sharper mental clarity and significantly lower baseline anxiety within a matter of weeks.
But Riker doesn't just frame this as a simple digital detox for wellness, does he?
No, not at all. He frames it as rebuilding neural armor. He adopts the language of biological warfare, utilizing SEAL team protocols for bioweapon exposure. Recognize the toxin, isolate the exposure, neutralize the agent, and rebuild the infrastructure.
It's extremely militarized language.
Very. He poses a deeply provocative question to the reader. What percentage of your daily thoughts actually belong to you, and what percentage were engineered in a San Francisco boardroom to harvest your attention?
He also points to global health data to validate this sense of biological crisis, right?
Yes, the framing of media consumption as bioweapon exposure is a hallmark of this worldview. It emphasizes that the modern environment is not neutral, it is actively hostile to male biology. He points to World Health Organization reports indicating that 1 in 3 Generation Z males now exhibits clinical vitality deficits.
What does that mean, practically?
It ranges from lowered grip strength to reduced sperm counts and chronic fatigue. He uses highly inflammatory language here, arguing that a man's brain on algorithmically driven feminist content is scrambled eggs with soy sauce, estrogenic, denatured, and fundamentally unserious.
So that is a core claim that modern ideology doesn't just change your mind, it physically alters you at the mitochondrial level.
Absolutely.
To combat this biological degradation, he introduces the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, specifically the will to power, and he updates it for the 21st century. And this is where he brings in 2 of the most polarizing figures of our time, Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate. How does he use Nietzsche to explain their massive popularity?
This is a vital part of the book for understanding the current cultural moment. He uses Nietzsche's concept of the will to power, the fundamental drive to achieve the highest possible position in life, to explain why millions of men gravitate toward these figures. He recalls a specific moment, Jordan Peterson's famous 2018 interview on Britain's Channel 4 with journalist Kathy Newman.
Oh, I remember that interview.
During the interview, Newman repeatedly tried to corner Peterson with the phrase, "So what you're saying is," at one point she tried to trap him by asking, "So you're saying we should force monogamy?" Peterson didn't blink, didn't apologize, and simply responded, "No, I'm saying culture already does."
And that clip went completely viral.
It garnered over 25 million views in a single week. Riker notes that young men downloaded and analyzed that exchange like it was the Zapruder film. Why? Because, according to Riker, Peterson successfully weaponized cold, unyielding logic against a media apparatus that is accustomed to demanding apologies from men.
He ties this back to the TMU theory we discussed earlier, doesn't he?
He does. He says Peterson hacked the syntax. When Peterson tells young men to stand up straight with your shoulders back, Riker argues he isn't offering posture advice. He is commanding them to occupy their ontological niche to take up physical and cosmic space without guilt.
And how does he extend this analysis to Andrew Tate, who is obviously a much more controversial and aggressive figure than Peterson?
Riker approaches Tate not by defending his specific controversies, but by analyzing the mechanics of his phenomenal rise. Regardless of how mainstream media labels Tate, Riker points out that his audience grew faster than a Bitcoin bull run. He argues this happened because an entire generation of men who were starved of primal truth and tired of being pathologized recognized Tate's unapologetic framing of male ambition, wealth generation, and physical dominance as a sacred duty.
He has a specific quote about Tate's real crime, right?
Yeah, Riker claims that in the eyes of the manosphere, Tate's real crime wasn't sexism. His crime was exposing what Riker calls the castration cult, hiding behind progressive phrases like toxic masculinity. He frames Tate's millions of followers not as an anomaly, but as a silent majority actively rejecting the academic lie that masculinity is merely a social construct.
He pairs this cultural analysis with a very strict, highly regimented physical protocol that he calls hydration warfare. What exactly is he telling men to do to their bodies?
He provides a deeply ascetic regimen. The hydration warfare protocol requires men to fast on a grueling 23-1 eating window, meaning they fast for 23 hours a day and consume all their calories in a single 1-hour window.
That is intense.
And they are required to drink a gallon of trace mineralized water daily. And the overarching rule is to accept zero excuses. He appeals to evolutionary biology, stating that our Paleolithic ancestors did not evolve by eating 6 small, balanced meals a day. They conquered continents, hunted massive game, and survived ice ages in the spaces between fasts.
He also brings in some compelling international data regarding testosterone to back up this need for a physiological reset.
Yes, he looks at global testosterone statistics to argue that Western men are in a state of endocrinal collapse. He points out that Japan's average male testosterone level currently sits around 450 nanograms per deciliter, while in countries with more traditional or rugged cultures like Argentina, the average is closer to 650.
And he brings in a Harvard study too, right?
Right. To drive the ideological point home, he cites a Harvard meta-analysis which found that politically conservative men average 12% higher testosterone than liberal men. Riker directly correlates this hormonal difference with a biological drive for mate competition, territorial dominance, and boundary maintenance.
You mentioned Nietzsche earlier. How does Riker map Nietzsche's philosophy onto this biological evolution he is demanding?
He fully integrates Nietzsche's allegory of the 3 metamorphoses of the spirit, the camel, the lion, and the child, and maps it perfectly onto the evolution of the modern man.
Let's break those down. Who is the camel in Riker's view?
The camel is the modern, compliant man. He is the beast of burden who voluntarily takes on the weight of society's guilt. He is the man sitting through corporate HR diversity seminars, apologizing for his privilege, adopting vegan diets out of environmental guilt, and constantly asking how he can be a better ally. He bears the load of everyone else's demands.
And the lion.
The lion is the awakening. This is the man who discovers Jordan Peterson, starts lifting weights, and realizes he doesn't have to carry the burden anymore. The lion roars no to the dragon of societal expectations. He rejects the guilt, rejects the physical weakness, and violently throws off the baggage of the camel.
But the lion isn't the final stage, according to Nietzsche. It's the child. How does Riker interpret the child?
This is where Riker's synthesis is most potent. The child, in Nietzsche's philosophy, represents a sacred yes, a new beginning, and the power to create one's own values. Riker interprets the child as the fully actualized man.
Give me an example of the child in modern terms.
He is the CEO who no longer complains about diversity consultants, but simply fires them and builds his own company. He is the man who lifts heavy, builds his empire, eats a steak without moral hesitation, and establishes his own dominion. Riker explicitly links diet to this ideology, stating that replacing meat with soy isn't an evolutionary upgrade, it is the biological surrender note signed in Tempa Inc.
Wow.
In this framework, endocrinal warfare is real, and testosterone is the living water.
That sets us up perfectly to examine the concept of hierarchy itself. He dedicates a massive portion of the text to arguing that hierarchy is not a social construction invented by the patriarchy, but a matter of absolute physical, biological, and natural law. He famously states, biology isn't bigotry.
This is the ideological core that stands in direct, uncompromising opposition to Marxist theories of egalitarianism or modern DEI initiatives. Riker is attempting to prove, using data from the natural world and military testing, that whenever humanity attempts to artificially flatten a hierarchy in the name of equality, it doesn't achieve utopia, it invites catastrophe.
Because the universe demands order.
The underlying premise is that the universe demands an ordered, unforgiving chain of command for survival. Attempting to subvert this natural law through modern policies is framed as a form of civilizational suicide. Power, he argues, abhors a vacuum just as much as nature does.
The examples he uses to prove this are brutal. He points to the animal kingdom first, specifically a 2015 study on elephants in Kenya's Tsavo region. What did that study reveal about leadership and survival?
It is a harrowing but highly effective illustration for his point. The 2015 Tsavo elephant study tracked herds during periods of severe, devastating drought. Researchers observed a stark difference in survival outcomes based on the leadership structure of the herds. They found that herds led by older female matriarchs suffered 22% higher mortality rates compared to herds led by older male bulls.
Why such a massive difference in mortality?
Because of how the different genders made decisions under existential pressure. The researchers noted that the matriarchs often made sentimental decisions. They would slow the herd down to accommodate the weakest, youngest, or sickest calves, refusing to abandon them.
And as a result?
As a result, the entire herd would fail to reach the distant water sources in time, leading to mass die-offs. The male bulls, however, did exactly what evolution programmed them to do in a crisis. They made ruthless, unsentimental, purely hydraulic decisions.
They left the weak behind.
They abandoned the weaker calves to the predators in the drought, forced the herd to march at a brutal pace, and as a result, they preserved the core of the herd and secured its genetic future. Riker uses this to state definitively that sentimentality dies when the watering hole dries up.
He translates that exact logic into human systems, specifically looking at military combat effectiveness. What data does he bring forward regarding the Marines?
He reinforces the wildlife study with the controversial 2020 Marine Corps mixed gender combat unit tests. The military conducted extensive simulated life or death combat scenarios to evaluate the effectiveness of integrating women into frontline infantry roles.
And what did the data show?
The data showed that all female rifle teams required male physical assistance in 30% of the simulated engagements, whether it was carrying heavy wounded personnel or scaling walls. Furthermore, co-ed units took 53% longer to breach buildings and complete tactical objectives than the all-male squads.
How does Riker interpret that delay?
Brutally. In warfare, as Riker puts it, seconds are not measured on a stopwatch, they're measured in body bags. He uses this military data to assert that the modern political demand for absolute gender parity in high-stakes life or death environments is a delusion of safety born of peacetime luxury. He argues it is an ideological vanity project that ultimately costs lives when reality asserts itself.
And he doesn't stop at the military. He brings this concept of natural hierarchy directly into the white-collar corporate world. He introduces a concept he calls the feminist drag coefficient. What is that?
It's a metric he invented for corporate auditing. He instructs his readers to take their company's internal meeting minutes or HR memos and circle every single instance of words like feelings, safe space, consensus, or collaborative process.
And he views those words as negatives.
He argues that every single one of those words represents a unit of wasted kinetic energy that should be violently directed outward toward dominating the market and destroying the competition. He claims that feminine leadership styles, which naturally prioritize internal cohesion, care, and emotional equilibrium, act as a drag coefficient on the aerodynamic speed of a purely masculine hierarchical enterprise.
He points to a real-world corporate disaster to illustrate what happens when that drag coefficient takes over, right? The collapse of a company called Zenefits.
Yes, the spectacular collapse of the HR software company Zenefits in 2017. At its peak, Zenefits had a $4.5 billion valuation and was the darling of Silicon Valley. But they instituted an aggressively egalitarian, anti-hierarchical corporate culture, most notably a no-managers policy.
They wanted a flat structure.
They wanted a flat structure where everyone was equal and collaborative. Riker points out that the company didn't fail because they had a bad product. They failed because of hierarchy collapse. The lack of rigid structure created a massive responsibility vacuum. Without a patriarch or a clear chain of command to enforce discipline, chaos took over.
What happened exactly?
It was later revealed that up to 83% of their sales reps were falsifying compliance documents. The company's valuation plummeted to near bankruptcy.
So his point is that when you remove clear hierarchy, you don't get equality, you get corruption.
Exactly. That Xenophyte's example perfectly encapsulates his warning that power abhors a vacuum. When you remove a clear, masculine hierarchical structure, you do not magically manifest a utopia of equal, harmonious collaboration. You get a Lord of the Flies scenario of chaos, backstabbing, and institutional corruption. He even ties this corporate failure back to ancient theology, referencing the biblical story of Queen Jezebel usurping the throne of Israel.
How does Jezebel fit into corporate HR structures?
He points out a specific detail in the biblical narrative. While enemy chariots were literally storming the gates of the city to destroy her, Jezebel's reaction was to go to her chambers, paint her eyes, and meticulously do her hair.
Right.
Riker uses this ancient text to argue that feminine priorities, when placed at the top of a hierarchy, will naturally drift toward cosmetic, internal, or social concerns, completely ignoring the external existential threats until the gates are breached. Therefore, he claims, natural law mandates male kingship and unyielding hierarchical dominance to protect the perimeter of civilization.
The arguments are intense, unapologetic, and clearly designed to provoke. That brings us to the final major concept of the book, which pushes his theories into the most primal physiological extremes possible. He moves into what he calls sexual hydrology and ancestral springs.
Right, getting into the physical applications.
This is where he treats male sexuality not as an emotional experience, but as a kinetic energy system. And he starts by looking at medieval monks. What is the historical precedent he is drawing from here?
He looks at the 12th century Benedictine monks in the Burgundy region of France. These were men who took vows of extreme asceticism. Their manuscripts detailed practices where they would literally plunge themselves into frozen, ice-choked rivers in the dead of winter.
To what end?
The monks wrote that they did this to quench the hellfire in the loins. They poetically described the violent chattering of their teeth as angels' hammers forging their spiritual discipline. Riker uses this historical anecdote to introduce his audience to the practice of semen retention and sexual discipline.
He's addressing the modern epidemic of digital addiction, specifically pornography, isn't he?
Yes. He addresses the massive silent epidemic of pornography consumption among modern men, but he doesn't treat it as a moral failing in the traditional religious sense. He treats male sexuality as a hydraulic system. It is raw, kinetic, creative energy. He argues that this energy can either be harnessed, pressurized, and used to build an empire, or it can be mindlessly leaked away into a digital void of pixels and algorithms.
So the porn industry is...
He argues that the modern porn industry is the ultimate bioweapon, designed to siphon off the very energy that men need to conquer reality.
Does he have modern neurological science to back up what the monks were doing in the frozen rivers?
He does, and he leans heavily on recent neuroscience to validate these ancient practices. He cites a 2023 study from the Journal of Behavioral Neuroscience. The researchers found that 72% of men who forced themselves to take blastingly cold ice showers every morning reported that their cravings for pornographic material were cut in half within just 8 weeks.
What's the biological mechanism behind that? He mentions a specific brain scan study.
He goes deep into the neurochemistry. He details a 2023 fMRI study focused on a 28-year-old electrician who suffered from severe pornography addiction. The subject traded his nightly digital habit for a regimen of 3-minute ice baths. After 60 days, they scanned his brain. The results showed that his ventral striatum, which Riker refers to as the brain's dopamine slot machine, lit up 43% less when he was shown NSFW material.
Because of the cold exposure.
Yes, the science demonstrates that severe cold exposure actually upregulates D2 receptors in the brain.
Why are D2 receptors important?
Because those are the exact dopamine receptors that chronic pornography consumption downregulates and destroys. By destroying those receptors, men lose their drive, their motivation, and their baseline joy in difficult tasks. Riker explains that our Paleolithic ancestors didn't get their reward circuit zapped by staring at glowing rectangles in a dark room. They got massive hits of survival chemicals by crossing ice-laden rivers, hunting dangerous game, and overcoming physical trauma.
To recreate that, he introduces a specific breathing technique he calls the dam breaker.
Yes, the dam breaker.
How does the dam breaker breathwork function?
It's a visualization and physiological exercise. You inhale deeply for 4 seconds, explicitly visualizing the sharp freezing air of an Alaskan glacier filling your lungs. You hold that breath, pressurizing the system for 4 seconds. Then you exhale for 4 seconds, visualizing the release of swamp toxins, estrogenic societal programming, and weakness.
And he pairs this breathing technique with a highly specific 15-day protocol. What does that entail?
The 15-day protocol is designed to be a total biological reset. Days 1 through 7 require absolute abstinence, a total fast from sexual release of any kind. This is coupled with plunging into ice baths at both dawn and dusk.
Shocking the system.
The goal is to shock the vagus nerd into absolute compliance and silence the modern craving for cheap dopamine. By day 8, once the initial withdrawal is broken, the protocol shifts. You begin consuming a gallon of spring water heavily dosed with Himalayan salt.
Why the Himalayan salt? What is the logic there?
Riker claims it mimics the mineral-dense raw springs that our ancient ancestors drank from. The logic here is actually brilliant from a purely evolutionary psychology standpoint. He states that human evolution hardwired our biology to interpret specific types of scarcity, like freezing cold, caloric fasting, and the lack of sexual release as an environmental signal to dominate and survive, rather than to mate and relax.
By voluntarily inducing this severe scarcity.
By doing that, Riker argues, you physically flip the biological switch in your brain. You transition from being a passive, pacified consumer into a highly alert apex predator.
The results he claims from this protocol are pretty wild. What are the metrics he provides?
He claims that out of a test group of 600 men who completed the 15-day fast, 89% reported experiencing unshakable focus and a total elimination of brain fog. Even more surprisingly, he claims 67% of those men received promotions, started new businesses, or negotiated significant raises within 6 months, purely because their newly harnessed aggressive energy was redirected into their professional lives.
He also connects this physical state of hydration and discipline directly to relationship dynamics. He has this concept called the 1% rule.
Yes, the 1% rule links hydration directly to emotional stability and relationship harmony. He states that for every 1% of body water loss, a man's biology triggers 1% more petty, reactive arguments with his partner.
So dehydration equals arguments.
Basically. He backs this up with fascinating data from the Kinsey Institute, showing that couples who actively synchronize their water intake and maintain high hydration levels actually have 22% more sex.
How does evolutionary biology explain that?
Because, in our ancestral past, hunter-gatherer males had to physically secure a safe, abundant water source before they could even think about mating or starting a family. Dehydration in the Paleolithic era meant tribal extinction. Therefore, subconsciously, a dehydrated modern man becomes irritable, anxious, and sexually disengaged because his ancient biology thinks he is failing his primary survival task. As Riker notes, quoting a famous podcaster, half of his problems are literally just dehydration.
That is the ultimate physicalization of his entire philosophy. But he takes it one step further in Chapter 11, moving from the individual's physical optimization to the concept of temporal legacy. He calls it ancestral springs. What is he pushing back against here?
He is pushing back against what the United Nations refers to as universal citizenry. This is the modern, globalized ideal of being a rootless, cosmopolitan consumer who belongs to everywhere and nowhere, completely disconnected from blood, soil, and history.
Riker despises this concept.
He truly does. He wants men to stop drinking from the polluted tap water of globalized culture and instead drink from the deep ancestral springs of their own specific lineage.
He uses a really evocative archaeological discovery to make this point about lineage.
He talks about an excavation in Reykjavik, Iceland in 2015 where archaeologists uncovered an ancient Viking well. Carved deep into the stone of the well were runic inscriptions that translated to "Water remembers what bones forget."
Water remembers what bones forget.
Exactly. For 9 consecutive generations, Viking warriors drank from that exact same spring before voyages and battles, believing that with each sip they were physically ingesting the resolve, the violence, and the triumphs of their forebears.
He instructs the reader to recreate this connection by crafting a lineage mantra. How does that work?
He demands that men know exactly who they are and where they come from. He shares his own lineage mantra in the book Conrad Riker, son of Bavarian stonemasons, builder of cathedrals. He instructs men to silently recite their lineage mantra right before they perform a heavy deadlift or enter a high-stakes corporate negotiation.
Does he have data for this too?
He cites data from the Endocrine Society suggesting that men who operate with a strong internalized narrative of ancestral pride actually maintain baseline testosterone levels nearly double those of men who view themselves as rootless individuals.
He is advocating for the hydraulic power of compound interest, applying it to habit, heritage, and genetics. And he uses a concept from Warren Buffett to explain this discipline.
Yes, he takes Warren Buffett's famous 20-slot rule for investing, the idea that if you wouldn't hold a stock for 20 years, you shouldn't waste one of your limited investment slots on it for even 20 minutes. Riker applies this ruthlessly to daily habits.
So if it doesn't build the legacy, drop it.
If a habit, a relationship, or a media diet does not actively build your generational legacy, you must discard it immediately. To anchor this discipline, he provides a daily ritual he calls the tactical hydration stack.
Let's hear the tactical hydration stack. What is the daily routine he prescribes?
It is a regimented 3-part daily ritual. At dawn, you consume a large glass of heavily salted Himalayan water. The goal is to immediately reset the adrenal rhythms and spike blood pressure to optimal waking levels, signaling to the body that the hunt has begun.
And at noon.
At noon, you consume spring water spiked with pure lemon juice. He claims this alkalizes the body, turning it into a testosterone forge during the peak stress hours of the workday. Finally, at dusk, you drink a potent pomegranate tea. Pomegranate is a natural vasodilator, so this floods the veins with nitric oxide, aiding in physical recovery and sexual health.
Every single sip is regimented.
Every single sip throughout the day is framed not as wellness, but as a deliberate strike against the entropy and decay of modern life. He completely rejects the $9 billion modern wellness industry, which he views as peddling pastel-labeled vulnerability and weakness. As he writes, real men hydrate their cells and their lineage, they do not hydrate their insecurities.
So when we step back and synthesize the sheer volume of philosophy, biology, and sociology we've just covered, what is the ultimate takeaway from holy hydration?
The ultimate takeaway is a radical, uncompromising challenge to modern men. Riker is demanding that they stop being passive reservoirs, merely holding space for what he views as cultural decay, and instead become unstoppable kinetic currents.
It's a call to reclaim the traditional roles.
Exactly, to reclaim the protector and provider roles, to build rigid, unforgiving aqueducts of physical and mental discipline, and to thoroughly reject the modern therapeutic DEI-driven culture. Riker views biology, natural hierarchy, and the drive for conquest not as oppressive social constructs that need to be dismantled, but as the divine, immutable code of reality itself.
It functions as a complete war manual for a specific worldview. He wants men to flood the desert of modern culture. As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over something that builds on the intense source material we've just explored, but looks beyond its immediate conclusions.
Let's hear it.
Throughout this entire text, Riker heavily relies on the physics of water. He uses a substance that is inherently fluid, adaptable, essential, and life-giving to argue for the necessity of strict, rigid hierarchy and unyielding male dominance. But if human nature truly mirrors the flow of water, what happens when a society tries to permanently dam up the natural currents of either masculinity or femininity?
That's the real question.
Right. If modern institutions are acting as a dam against traditional male energy, as Riker claims, will it eventually lead to a catastrophic, uncontrollable flood that violently destroys the entire system? Or, through all this immense cultural pressure and friction, are we simply being forced to evolve, slowly carving out a completely new kind of landscape entirely? Think about that as you observe the cultural shifts happening around you.
It is a profound historical question. The fundamental forces of nature, much like human nature, cannot be artificially suppressed indefinitely without severe consequence.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us on this extensive deep dive. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the show so you never miss out on these deep explorations into the ideas shaping our world. And remember, to truly comprehend the depth, the historical references, and the intense perspective of this cultural artifact, you really need to read it for yourself. Go check Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to buy Holy Hydration. And be sure to follow the author at Conrad Raker on Substack to see how these theories are evolving in real time. Until next time, stay curious.